Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, Ashley. Oh, I always call you Ashley Brown. Hello, Ashley Brown.
I know. Hello, Scott Osborne. How are you?
I'm good. Do people call you, wait a minute, do people call you Ms. or Miss? This is the South, or Mrs. I do know you're married. What do people call you, and how do you feel about that?
Most are Ms. And I have a couple of friends who use my husband's name for
Okay.
me, and I am Templeton to them if I get cards or anything, which I think just goes to show what their feelings are of traditional versus not. And God
But
love my
you did not
husband.
change your name, is that correct? So
I
they
did
just made
not.
an assumption. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Brown. How
Yeah.
easy can you get? Like,
Exactly.
let's not mess with
Your
that.
initials are AB. We can do this.
AB, and as you know, I signed half my things AB, like we're good.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's funny.
I know. So,
Well, I was always Ms., but at one time I taught, and this being the South, I was Miss Scott. I was always Miss Scott, and I sort of got used to it. It was kind of funny, but that's
right.
it.
I know. Oh, that's true. Well,
Yeah.
and you having a
Yeah.
traditional male
Yeah.
name, I bet you and Michael Saunders could probably do a stand-up routine on
Good.
that.
Yeah, and now, of course, it's much more common for women to have, traditionally male names. When I was young, it was almost unheard of. And for many, many things, until photos and images started being attached to like your emails and all, I would often be misunderstood. And once they wouldn't let me get access to my bank account, this was all pre-internet, but some of that's changed. But anyway, yeah, it is interesting. People make assumptions if they just see my name and then they'll like code switch. I have a lot of experiences of that. People code switch.
Oh,
It's
I
like, oh, okay, okay. And the voice changes, the whole thing.
Well, and I just wonder if, and I know, and if anybody in our community, Michael Saunders, who's a realtor, if you've heard her speak, she'll tell the story. I've heard her tell it many times of getting into law school only to then be like, oop, nope, just kidding. We thought you
Yeah.
were a
Yeah.
male. So just interesting speaking to the times that we were living in that so I'd be curious, yeah, that'd be interesting of how many responses you would get from a blind resume not knowing whether you were male or female or interesting. Hmm.
And I can also tell, just small digression. I can tell, when you meet people for the first time, the cocktail party, whatever you want to call it, sometimes people listen to a name and sometimes they don't. I can tell if they're not listening if they don't say something about it. Because if people have heard it, they invariably will say, "Oh, that's interesting," or "How did you get that?" or "What does it mean?" And if there's nothing, it's like you just didn't even, which is fine. It happens all the time in social settings. It didn't even register.
So now I'm curious, and none of this is what we're supposed to be talking about,
No,
PS,
it's
but it's
not.
fun. Is it your mother's maiden name?
It is not my mother's maiden name, and I have an older brother whose name is Christopher. So
Oh,
they did not want a son. I have a son. F. Scott Fitzgerald has a daughter named Scott, who was called Scotty, and that's who
oh,
I was named after. Yes, they were very taken with. And if you follow anything in literature, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I was always called Scotty when I was a child. So yes, that's where it's from.
oh, oh my. I
Oh
think that,
my.
oh my, I think
We're done
maybe.
now with personal digressions.
Okay,
What
Scotty,
are we
take it
talking
away.
about childcare, though? This is a nice segue to a childcare
It is.
conversation. Who is taking care of America's children and who is naming them, more importantly?
Hey, it always comes together, right?
And I wanted to do this show because, as you know, we have shows on stay-at-home dads. I thought it was very, very important. We have a great show coming up with Jeff Hartman, who's a full-time stay-at-home dad. He had a career in the military and then other things and left that to be a stay-at-home dad for a while. In any event, I thought before we focused on that, which is important, we should really take a sort of broader look at like who is taking care of America's children? What
Mhm.
does this look like? What does it cost? We did have an earlier show. You remember
Mhm.
about Manatee County
Yep.
specifically,
It was April 25th. We had Brittany Lamont, who's actually
right?
leading the Lakewood Ranch Business Alliance, but doing the Workforce Childcare Task Force, and it's
Right.
a Sarasota, and then Manatee has a separate one of really when childcare starts impacting employers and the economy, then I think that it starts having, I think there's more meaningful conversation around it.
Businesses start taking notice.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that was my takeaway from talking to her is that local businesses were taking notice. So that's one angle of it, but an important one. But I do remember that, and I thought we should really sort of put some basics in front of people a little bit and do the research ourselves on who's taking care of children. So some of the things that we pulled together, some
Hmm.
nice little data, if I've got this right, and I know you will correct me if I, for some reason, misspeak. We know that 55% of children under 5
Hmm.
have some form of non-parental care. Doesn't mean it's necessarily full-time, but over half of the children have something, daycare, Head Start, some sort of pre-K,
Hmm.
or here it might be a VPK, some sort of other childcare, not with a relative or a family member. So we know that over half, I was actually surprised it wasn't greater. Um,
Hmm.
but we also know that almost for 34% are cared for by a relative. So children are cared for by people who are not their parents
Hmm.
in great numbers. Parents obviously are in their prime working years. It's
Hmm.
just a necessity, and that age, with very few exceptions, do need to work. So people need out of the quote unquote nuclear family childcare arrangements by almost everyone. Mothers are 4 times more likely to live alone with children than fathers. I found that fascinating. So that's
Yeah.
a
Can you repeat that one?
yeah. So mothers are almost 4 times more likely to live alone with their children than their
Hmm.
father, than a man. So
Right.
that's those single-headed female head
Hmm.
of household families that we see all the time, where you've got
Yeah. And I just wanted to pop in because I always think it's important to talk about the economic realities for families, and I'm talking about specific to our region in Southwest Florida, but even throughout the state of Florida, almost half of our families live below a sustainable wage, a comfortably sustainable wage. And single female headed households with children in Manatee County and Sarasota County, which people think about as more affluent, we're on the Gulf Coast, it's education, it's arts, 75%
wait,
of,
75%.
yeah,
Let me make sure I got it.
75% live
Wow.
below a sustainable wage, which is, that's huge.
Which
That's,
I think if you live in Sarasota, you understand it better. But it's true. We've got a relatively affluent, older population, not just
mhm,
retirees or snowbirds, but older. And then we've got a large, significant, I'll say working class, middle class, however you define that, but working age
mhm,
group, which is struggling, probably primarily because of housing costs, especially are so high here. But that's
right.
a and childcare. So it's interesting. So all of these children are being cared for by someone else.
Mhm,
We do see a growing share of dads. It's still a distinct minority, perhaps 1 in 5. At some point, there'll be a stay-at-home dad taking care of children. They tend to be lower income, and many of them tend to be unemployed anyway. In other words, men with children may want employment or want employment that pays enough, but if they can't find it, the default is stay at home with children, which women have been in that situation as well. There's no question. But often it's not by choice that you are a stay at home parent, especially for dads who might want other employment. It's not there. They don't have the credentials, whatever the problem is or the issue is. They may be more likely to be stay at home dads. But we see about 1 in 5 children now will have a stay at home dad at some point. They tend to also be older stay at home
mhm.
dad. It's kind of interesting.
Well, and
Um,
when you look at employment too, there was some really interesting statistics on the percentage of workers that have access to child care benefits through the
yeah,
employer, which is, I think it was 12%.
12%. Oh, yeah, that was fascinating. 12% of US workers have access to benefits through their employer, and that drops to 6% for people who are part-time or in lower income. So that 12%, that's primarily higher income already families, many of whom, even though childcare is always a financial stretch, are a little bit better prepared to pay for it. So typically, these 12% that have company benefits are tend to be in higher income jobs to begin with, is what we're saying. Tends to be larger companies, and the benefits might be even just something like emergency care. It isn't necessarily, full-time child care. It might be
Mm-hmm.
emergency care. It might be some sort of partial financial benefit. They kind of crack that nut in a couple different ways. Some will literally have on-site child care provided for at a local facility. Um, Others provide some other sort of benefits.
Yeah.
But the reality is, children don't care for themselves. For people who've maybe never had children, if you have a full-time job or anything close to it, you essentially need full-time care for children. And even public school kindergarten programs rarely, if ever, mesh with an employment schedule, even if
Right.
that's for your source of care. I know many, many moms who think, okay, when their child starts school, they can return to more of a full-time employment. Schedules simply do not mesh up. It's a literal impossibility. So
So
that
something that you pointed out last week, when we were just having conversation, was the real difference between extended families in the US versus globally. I think that's an interesting because I feel like having relatives be part of the caregiving support team, that we're not seeing that in the US.
Right, so I love global statistics. So I found this fascinating because the US is a total outlier. The highest rate in the world is our percentage of children in single parent homes. So we have
Hmm.
the highest percentage in the entire planet. 23% of children live in single parent homes. So what does that
Across
mean?
the globe, we're
Across
higher.
the globe. So much less likely to live in extended families.
Hmm.
8% of children live in extended families, grandparents, aunts, nieces, something like that, which around the globe typically provides a lot of childcare support, even if it isn't full time. It's emergency, it's maybe bridge after school, there's a grandma or somebody at home or a grandfather. In many, as you know, I've lived in many places, and often where mothers and fathers are both working, it is often an older relative, grandparent, aunt, uncle, somebody who's around the home and provides that bridge care or that full-time care or infant care, which is so time consuming. And America is one of the lowest. We don't, we prize our independence and we tend not to live in extended families. There's exceptions,
Yeah.
but we have
That's
8% children living in global families, and the global percentage is 38% live in extended families of children growing up in extended families. So
so
I have,
8% versus 38%.
yeah,
That's a pretty big swing.
it is. It's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. So right, so then when you think about,
Interesting.
well, how does childcare get taken care of? So we are looking to private sector alternatives, really. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know if extended families is a great solution for many people. Sometimes that has its own problems, but that is how a lot of childcare is provided in the rest of the world. We don't have that. We don't live that way. We move around, lots of reasons. But so we're always looking to private sector alternatives, which is how
Hmm.
we get to costs. So you probably know this. Costs for infant care or child care on average? Ashley, quiz?
Yeah. It is it is the second largest expense in a household,
After
which
house.
is just under housing. It is often, you're looking at $1,000 a month.
Yeah, easily. Infant care is even more. Infant care average is 1,200 a month.
Yeah.
Um, and in 2024, the average for child care centers over 13,000 a year.
Hmm.
So, again, it's only your more affluent and families in very established reliable work. If you're not in reliable work that you can really count on with some consistency, boy, that's really tough to do. It's interesting when they look at when the costs are too high, what families do. They tend to switch to informal care where they can get it. Grandparents, we live here in Sarasota, Florida. I know many older grandparents who say they moved to be closer to working parents and their grandchildren so they can
Hmm.
provide support. There's no
Yeah.
questions. People will say, "Hey, grandparents, you got to move closer to me." And because that has to be taken care of. Or what parents do is they reduce their hours or they leave work. And that's where Brittany comes in, and you
Mhm.
see women are not able to be in the workforce in the numbers they would like to be, and probably the numbers lots of employers would like them to be in.
Well, and it's that catch 22 of when you look for long-term asset building, wealth building, why women lag in those numbers, because typically it is the female that's making adjustments and accommodations to the work schedule and earning potential. And all of your earning potential goes into your Social Security and what your benefit's going to be when you get to the retirement age, whatever that magic number may be one day. So it's a snowball effect that we don't always have a full awareness of, and the number of elder women 65 and older that struggle more financially because of lack of savings and asset building in their biggest earning potential, which also correlate with the child rearing age, right? That's
Thank you. Yes.
it's a problem.
Thank you for connecting the dot. Both the pay gap and the asset gap, so-called, trace a lot to the so-called motherhood penalty. There's no
Hmm.
question. Women without children, financially, in that sense, if they're employed, they have an advantage because there is a motherhood penalty, as it's called, usually from either stepping out of the workforce for a period of time, taking a job with less responsibility, more flexibility, taking a part-time job, but they are reducing their overall work, and that totally reduces their assets by the end of life. So we do see it. It creeps. But there's another element. We talked a lot about children, but many people, and again, especially women, provide unpaid care for others, for the
Hmm.
elderly, for a disabled relative. We don't
Hmm.
have a lot of support services compared to some other countries
Hmm.
for those people in this country. And so it tends to fall to women, not only, but majority women, and that's care that has to be provided. Elderly parents, others. I know people who care for elderly aunts and uncles because there's no one else to care for them.
Hmm.
So that care is also part of the burden, and it means that there will be people who do trade-offs for less work. There was a Pew study that looked at adult care. It was very interesting. And they said 1 in 7 people provide some sort of adult care, for another adult.
Hmm.
If they struggled to find time to do it, where was the trade-off? Was it like leisure time or cooking time or something else? And in fact, the trade-off that they had to make is, you see, their work hours, their paid employment had to be reduced.
Hmm.
So they fewer hours, they were clocking in, or a different job. So we do know that pay gap and asset gap are also due to other forms of care, in addition to childcare, while we're on the care situation.
Well, and I think just talking about this issue in very, I think, real black and white terms without any of the emotional ties to either judgment or um, whatever you want to layer onto it helps us understand that sometimes there are systems that just don't work for anybody.
Mhm.
They don't work for the individual, they don't work for business, they don't work for the government. Like, and childcare is a shining example, and I would say elder care too. I would throw that in. That is something that's not serving anyone, because it's expensive. It's not great for employers because of inconsistency or having to replace people, or that's something that they have to deal with. And then the individual families that are just struggling not only financially but emotionally and stress. And so it's ripe for trying to evolve into something that works for people if we can find ways to communicate on what works. What
Mhm.
works, right?
And it's interesting, we did a show on Gen Z where we talk about attitudes between men and women sort of diverging. You see these big
Mm-hmm.
differences. This is one where I would say parents agree. I don't want to underestimate. They may be struggling together. Who the hell is going to reduce their employment hours? Who is going to be home? It tends to be the woman, but there are many, I'll say, couples, who for whom exactly they would like to solve this in the most advantageous way for all involved. People are not necessarily at odds. Yes, we do have single family headed households, but we also have lots of male-female couples who are struggling to sort of crack this nut with few good solutions. I sort of taking a historical perspective, before really the 60s, 70s, unpaid childcare was overwhelmingly the role of women who didn't
Mhm.
have other opportunities. And, as a society that worked. I mean, and that disappeared. And we haven't found anything suitable that is filling it. So people are just kind of desperately pulling at this and that and the other. And as we know, it's harder and harder for any family to have only one income,
Mhm.
um, regardless of the gender that is attached to. It just is very hard for families to do that. So if more than one person has to work, who takes care of children? It's a very troubling. As someone who cares deeply, as a former teacher at one point, about the influences on children and how they're raised, good childcare, wherever that comes from, is very,
Mhm.
very important. It's not something that's just an afterthought.
And it's not just about the child care, it's about the development of the child too. Like when we talk about what are their interactions? What are they being exposed to language wise and all of that? And, if you talk about the neurodevelopment and the difference between children who are read to and engaged with, and all of those things lead to better outcomes and for everyone. And I don't know, I think this is another shining example of if we really talk about the things that we want for each other and for our communities, I feel like we would find a lot of alignment on what some solutions could be if we can get the noise out of the way on, whose fault is it? Isn't that always, why do we have to have fault and blame? Sometimes
Well, it's
things just,
interesting. Yeah, because I fear if we could get the noise out of the way, because I fear that this will be something that is seen as a woman's problem and they're the cause of it. And if we were to have some sort of programs, let's just say in a fantasy world, that help to provide childcare benefits, in our era currently in the US, which is very unsupportive of programs seeming to help women or to provide any advantages to women. We're in a current climate where that's not well supported by government, certainly, leaving aside private employers. If something like this were to be seen as a quote unquote benefit to women, it stands no chance, as
Mhm.
opposed to viewing it as a benefit for the next generation, a benefit for families,
For families.
for employers. We know that when many, many studies have shown that when employers do provide benefits for childcare, it redounds in huge benefits to the company. I mean, they have greater retention, they have greater employer productivity. Tons
Mhm.
of studies have shown that. I think we might even have some in the show notes. So,
Well, we do. And I had pointed it out, the positive returns of investment in childcare benefits, 90% to 425%. I mean, they're big, big. Like I'm like, that's a big number.
why can't
Um,
we get them to do it? We need to interview somebody in some company that's considered and be really honest and say, so what are the impediments? Is it, why, when you sit around and say, should we do this? And people provide obstacles and objections, what does that sound like? I really would like to know that.
ooh, I think we have a future show in the making. But I think we're in this weird space of um outrage. Like everybody's outraged about everything. And I think that there's a vision of who's receiving benefits and who's taking advantage of benefits. And the reality is these are our neighbors. These are people that are trying to make things work in a really untenable system of availability, cost, all of those things. So anyway, oh, I
Well, it's
feel
true, and we talked about it in another setting. We're in an era where no one seems to have any incentive for compromise, and this is the kind of thing
Mhm.
that takes compromises, And we're not in a moment culturally, politically, socially where that seems at all doable, and this kind of stuff suffers because it does. It takes compromise. It takes honest conversation, and it takes, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll sign up on
And
that.
again, and I feel it's important to say these are working families. These are not, yeah, these are working families. One of the things that was a bright spot, I was a couple weeks ago visiting another city and at a food and wine festival, very important research things happening there. No. And we were seated at a table with two young couples, they're 40. Um, One had two kids, one had three, and all working parents. And I loved that the dad and one of the couples, he and I were talking, and he was like, until we figure out universal childcare as a support, there's that's the only thing solving this issue. And he was a more conservative, traditional family, traditional home, but being able to see it that it really is a family issue. And I think you're right. It's often seen as the woman's issue of why are you not
Yeah.
willing to stay home? So,
Yeah.
all right,
And just as a final note, because we are almost out of time,
I know.
we mentioned this in an earlier show. There was a recent global survey on are people having the families they want. Remember we talked about this and the
Oh, yeah,
vast
yeah.
not, and it was costs. It was not that they didn't want children or their marriage wasn't good. It was costs. So,
Mhm.
Ashley,
Scott, I feel like I've been on a soapbox for the majority of this show. So thank you for giving me
thank
my
you.
space to,
My,
it's
my,
just such a big issue and it's probably because of the work I do and how much of it I see. But there's always opportunity and I love the conversations we have about it.
thank you for that work. And my dog is ushering us out if you can hear him. So, thank
Okay. All right.
you, Ashley.
Thank you, Scott. Till
And thank you,
next time.
everyone. Yes.